I often say I did my PhD at the University of Western Ontario on a very sophisticated topic called hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory. But I did a second university, which is not a university, a second learning from women who'd never been to school. Everything I know about ecology comes from the forest, but then also from the women of the forest, from the women of Chipko. They became my professors of biodiversity. They became my professors of ecology. And, having studied physics and having been groomed to think of in terms of hierarchies of knowledge, I was humbled. I was so humbled to see women with deep knowledge, with never a day of formal education. And then I realized how much of knowledge has been discounted, how much of women's knowledge has been discounted. In fact, with age, I'm realizing that the witch hunts of just 10 years before the Columbus bull of 1492, the bull was of 1493. 10 years before that, the papal bull that unleashed the Inquisition and the witch hunts killed 9 million people in Europe. And what was the massacre for? Most of them were women, for the knowledge they had. Knowledge with nature, not knowledge of conquering and mastering nature. So from my involvement with the Chipko movement, my understanding of how science had evolved, I had consciously shed a mechanical philosophy and learned more about quantum learning. But it was really my involvement with the Chipko movement that taught me so much about knowledge democracy, taught me so much about epistemic apartheid, and apartheid that people's knowledge doesn't count, women's knowledge doesn't count, indigenous knowledge doesn't count. And an absence of knowledge, actually, a system of power was elevated to be what was counted as science with a capital S. And I wrote a book. I was giving a talk at the Women's Summit in Nairobi in 1985. And the person who's been my publisher since then insisted that I write a book on women and ecology. And I'd just given up an academic job. And I said, no, I've shed the rat race. I've shed the chasing of writing papers, publishing. And she said, but writing can be a subversive activity. And write for the women's movement. So I wrote this book called Staying Alive, which has been published. I think it's also published in England, but it's definitely published in the United States. And I want to share 2 quotes in the book that also help remember that there are amazing women around the world rethinking the patriarchal roots of science and grounding science as nature-centered and women-centered. Caroline Merchant wrote a book called The Death of Nature. And in it she writes, the removal of animistic organic assumptions about the cosmos constituted the death of nature, the most far-reaching effect of the scientific revolution. Because nature was now viewed as a system of dead, inert particles, moved by external rather than inherent forces, the mechanical framework itself could legitimate the manipulation of nature. Moreover, as a conceptual framework, the mechanical order had associated with it a framework of values based on power, fully compatible with the directions taken by commercial capitalism. And I would add, colonial commerce. It was the same. Whose philosophy was defining the mechanical philosophy? Bacon. Bacon, whose philosophy is embodied in 2 books he wrote. One, The New Atlantis, that the world will be governed by supermen and superheroes. There'll be men, no place for women. And then he wrote a book called Temporis Partus Masculinus, the masculine birth of time, declaring all knowledge before that as feminine, because it was in relationship with nature. Bacon was also the Chancellor of England, and Bacon was in charge of the Inquisitions, of the witch hunts. So he applied to nature an Inquisition mode, that torture is the way you get the secrets out of nature. You have to subjugate her and turn her into your slave. And that philosophy, the mechanical philosophy, is not just what has continued in new ways, whether it's manipulating genes, creating GMOs, the new gene-edited GMOs, manipulating animals. That's where it all begins. And this was so intimately connected to colonialism. Boyle, who wrote the Boyle's Law, was head of the New England Company. And his work was to use the church to spread the mechanical philosophy. Interesting thing is, people think the church and the scientific revolution were 2 different camps. They were the same camp. They were the same camp of subjugation of nature, subjugation of women. And Evelyn Fox Keller, another dear friend, who's written a book called Reflections on Gender and Science, has noted, science has been produced by a particular subset of the human race, that is almost entirely by white middle-class males. For the founding fathers of modern science, the reliance on the language of gender was explicit. They sought a philosophy that deserved to be called masculine, that could be distinguished from its ineffective predecessors by its virile powers, its capacity to bind nature to man's service and to make her his slave. So no matter where I looked, it could be forestry, it could be rivers, you got to tame the river. You got to rape the river, is the language. I have a book called Water Wars, in which I have cited these metaphors. I think we've had a very long run of the domination of a reductionist, mechanistic knowledge as intelligence, but an intelligence that denies the creativity of nature, intelligence that separates that which is interconnected, an intelligence that degrades rather than regenerates, is not ecological intelligence. What we need today is what women are providing: emotional intelligence, intellectual intelligence, compassionate intelligence, cooperative intelligence, the power of caring. We have to make a transition from domination of greed and rewarding greed to practicing care and creating well-being and reclaiming the idea of wealth from the distorted idea of a few billionaires controlling the wealth of the world. This is where the feminist movement needs to be engaged, to create a deep ecology, to question not just this economy of greed, but the fake economy that destroys that which sustains us. This is the moment to reclaim the commons, and it is a moment to regenerate this beautiful earth of which we are a part.
A key principle of feminist leadership, and many of you will be familiar with this principle, is this idea that the personal is political. So it encompasses this idea that we must be the change we want to see in the world, and the idea that individual transformation and the social transformation that we seek can't be separated out from each other. So again, I go back to this point: feminist leadership is definitely not a practice for the faint-hearted. It's demanding a lot of us. Something she didn't say in the video, but which it's really important to know because it's an important part of feminist leadership, is that feminist leadership is about democratizing the idea of leadership. And it's a leadership approach that can be practiced by anyone. It doesn't rely on having positional power within an institution or an organization. And it recognizes that change can and must come from multiple levels. So this idea that we don't need to be a manager or a kind of a formal authority figure to kind of participate in feminist leadership, and this idea that we all hold some form of power and agency. And it encourages us to think about power in very different ways, very multidimensional ways, reminding us that we can practice leadership through our ideas, our passion, our creativity, our ability to inspire. It's not sharing power from a place of benevolence or charity. It is not a superficial or cosmetic or synthetic endeavor. What Srilata is talking about within feminist leadership is a really radical redistribution of power. It's something that requires us to think collectively rather than individually. And that's where the idea of collective leadership comes in. I wanted to share with you some ideas. And again, what I'm about to share with you are just some ideas or thoughts about what we think we are feminist leaders, what collective leadership means to us, and what we've learned about it through our work, where we've seen it work really, really well. What can that look like? So Letitia, would you mind sharing the slide again? I'll just wait for Letitia to do that. And while Letitia does that, while she shares the next slide, just want to say, you know, collective leadership can mean very different things in different contexts, and it can look different in different settings. And it also might look different according to the different types of work that we're doing. But so what I'm offering you here is just some helpful prompts or guidance or reflective prompts for critical thinking. So where we've explored collective leadership, you know, what is it? It can involve a group of people working together towards a shared goal. As you mentioned in the word cloud, it should involve sharing leadership power, responsibilities, as well as accountability in relation to some of the following areas. So it could involve sharing decision-making, which could be shared or rotated. It could relate to the ways in which resources are managed, so resources being managed and decisions being made regarding resources being more of a collective process rather than an individualistic one. Visioning and strategic planning would be something that's done collaboratively, you know, co-creation processes would be centered. Sharing leadership, there's also something there about, you know, responsibility for things like well-being, safety and security. That would shift to the responsibility of the collective rather than just one person. And then dealing with things like so-called failures and successes, that would depend on the leadership of a whole group rather than just one person. Thank you, Letitia. Would you mind moving to the next slide? Amazing, thank you. And we just wanted to give you a sense of how collective leadership how it really is still quite a radical leadership approach in many contexts, and how it really disrupts traditional paradigms. So if we look at the first column, you know, many traditional leadership paradigms, there's still a very strong narrative, this sense that people need to be inspired by a single visionary leader. Whereas in strong collective leadership models, there's this idea that people have an intrinsic motivation towards a shared purpose, that they can find inspiration in a variety of sources, not just in this single heroic leader. Inspiration might come from their peers. It might come from people who are, you know, quote unquote, more junior to them in an organization. A traditional leadership paradigm might say that people need to be led, but that, you know, under a collective leadership model, there's this assumption that people are inherently capable, they can be trusted to get on with their work. Under the traditional model, there's this idea that, well, decisions need to be top down. And conversely, under a collective model, decision-making, as I mentioned earlier, could be shared or rotated. under a traditional model, maybe there's this very small group of people involved in kind of solving conflicts or, you know, dealing with conflicts when they arise, but it's a much more expansive process under collective leadership models, whereby conflict resolution might be a shared process. Perhaps there's an element of peer-to-peer accountability. And then this idea of coaching or mentoring, which has this inherent hierarchy embedded into it. I think collective leadership models would promote a more horizontal method of learning. So there might be opportunities for peer mentoring or feminist mentoring approaches. Srilata Batlivala has done some really amazing work on what feminist mentoring might look like too. So you might want to check that out. Yeah, and I just wanted to say, you know, on this idea of decision making needing to be top down, and this idea of power that underlies the traditional leadership paradigms, you know, these very capitalist and patriarchal notions of power teach us that power is this limited commodity. It's something to be hoarded. And we may buy into those scarcity narratives. You know, we might fear, and many of us do, that when we share power, we're giving it away. But feminist understandings of power and more collective leadership models rooted in feminist thought encourage us to engage with the idea of power as abundant, you know, the sense that the more we share our power, the more our access to it grows. And we're also encouraged to think very critically about, well, what constitutes enough power for what we're trying to achieve for our mission, and whether we are the best people, you know, are we the best place to hold that power to make the change we desire? And it's really interesting. Srilata Batlivala always says, you know, when we have strong inner power, you know, that inner power that Vandana was talking about, I don't know whether you'd call it resilience or creative power, whatever you want to call it, the essential power we all carry within ourselves. When we have that strong inner power, we won't be afraid of sharing it, which I've always found a really incredibly useful way of looking at things. So how does this all link to feminist leadership? Next slide, please, Letitia. Yeah, so feminist leadership, as we mentioned earlier, it involves the redistribution of power. So it requires us to think about, how do we break down the ways in which power is so concentrated? How can we think of alternative ways of exercising power? And it means we need to disrupt that mainstream leadership paradigm in the table that I showed you earlier, in which we have the single hero leader. In feminist leadership approaches, leaders don't cultivate followers, they cultivate more and more leaders. It also enables us to bring, it's an approach that enables us to bring more voices to the table. It ensures more people are being heard, that decision-making is more kind of inclusive or open or transparent because there's more people being involved. And it breaks the fallacy that one person has all the answers in the first place. It kind of foregrounds this notion of humility, intellectual humility, I suppose. And it's about embodying the wider change we want to see in the world. We want to see more collective leadership models that work well, that don't end in the chaos that someone mentioned in the word cloud, that perhaps aren't quite as messy, and that enable us to stay focused on our social justice goals and aims. And I don't have this on the slide, but I've been thinking a lot about collective leadership and care, especially after Vandana was talking about care. You know, done well, I feel like it's a leadership model that creates the conditions for a stronger culture of care, because responsibility is shared, and that can really help to reduce pressure and leadership burdens. There's this saying, isn't there, that heavy is the head that wears the crown. What about if we redistributed that burden? We shared it more equitably. And then I also think a lot about collective leadership as a tool for power building, a way of building our power to sustain our struggles. There's a great Angela Davis quote where she says in her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, she says it is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. So yeah, there's a lot linking there. Collective leadership models, when done in a certain way, in a way that's aligned with feminist principles can be a big part of feminist leadership approaches. So as some examples of what it might look like in practice, collective leadership might involve things like job sharing, co-leadership models, project steering groups, working groups, boards or councils with rotating chairs, consensus decision-making processes. So there's such a wide variety of what collective leadership could look like.